Well, good afternoon, everyone. Very nice to see all of you here. And hello to all of the friends and colleagues who are joining us virtually, because we are live streaming today. I think that if we start off by saying that these are extraordinary times, that might be a little bit of an understatement. We have the Middle East is in flames. America is in turmoil, and the EU and other Western allies are anxiously awaiting a verdict coming this November as to whether or not we will have President Trump for the second term. American students who are engaged today over the last couple of weeks in peaceful protest on matters concerning the conflict in Gaza, for example. We've seen them forcibly removed from campus. We know even from before this, for the last couple of months, that a number of them at elite universities have had their job letters actually rescinded in this period of time because they have been associated with posts on social media declaring their affinity with respect of a particular cause. And across the world, it would seem that these are such troubling times. We get a sense that the people in the world today are moving in one direction, and the political leadership is moving in directions diametrically at odds with the mood of the people. And trust in democratic institutions and political leadership in many Western democratic societies seems to be at an all-time low. And, of course, there is war in Europe. And war in Europe is the subject of our conversation today. This event is the first in a series of conversations which we will have, examining the war in Ukraine and its implications not only for Ukraine and Russia or NATO or Western allies, but for the entire world. The consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine have been multifaceted, with significant disruption to the rules-based order in place since the Second World War. And now the war, in its third year, has been costly. It seems to have morphed into what we should probably acknowledge as a zero-sum game, for which the outcome today seems to be unclear. And effects extend beyond the shores of Europe. Sanction regimes meant to punish and isolate Russia are now in their 12th installment, and their reach and scope are unprecedented. One consequence is clear. Effects are being felt and borne by societies and communities around the world, including those who are the most vulnerable and those who are the most poor. Last year, for example, the World Bank issued a stark warning of a lost development decade for countries of the global south. And just a few days ago came another warning that developing countries have cumulatively lost 33% of GDP. 24 of the world's poorest countries will pay $21.5 billion in additional financing of their external debt during the next year and a half due to higher interest rates, 40% more than in the previous 2 years. There have been 18 sovereign debt defaults in countries of the global south. 1 in 4 of the world's poorest countries are in debt distress. Poverty is growing. Essentially, these countries are foregoing development to pay for debt. In some ways, this war has also been the tipping point in forging new alliances among countries of the global south, concentrated around their interest. They're now invested in a number of non-Western platforms, such as the BRICS, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, led by China and Russia, and engage in actions and coalitions to secure their interest in a fragmenting world. The purpose of our conversation today is not to discuss what those actions are. Perhaps in our question and answer and interactive session that might come up. But Western sanctions on Russia are being implemented by 15% of the world's population. The rest of the world are refusing to pick a side in a war which they only want to end. We get a sense that Western interests are no longer the interest of the rest of the world, and a number of newspapers have in fact spoken about the Global South as fence-sitting. I have argued in multiple pieces that I have written that these countries are not fence-sitting. They are in fact actively multi-aligned, working with all parties to secure their interest. We get a sense also that Western leadership is also being challenged by an array of actors around a field of shared grievances. Global economic output continues to tilt from west to east. Middle powers can no longer be ignored. And the Western power and global influence is also being contested. This is the backdrop against which our conversation takes place today. This first conversation in our series will focus on the effects of the war on the Russian state, its leadership and economy, the stability of CIS countries, Russia's deepening links with China, North Korea, Africa, and the Global South, the soft power of Russian culture and language, the failure of diplomacy, and reflections on how this all ends. Joining me here today is my colleague, Dr. Vladimir.
Zherebov.
Thank you, Vladimir, not wanting to do violence to your name. Vladimir and friends, welcome. Let's get started. Let's get started with the economy. Despite Russia's outside, shall we say, heft on the global stage, its economy is relatively small, approximating the size possibly of Italy. Despite 12 rounds of Russian sanctions on the country, the economy is still standing. In fact, it's more than standing. The IMF World Economic Outlook published just last week has projected growth of 3.2% for 2024, upwards from the 2.6% which was forecast as early or as recently as January. To put this in context, growth is faster than all advanced economies, 0.2 for the United Kingdom, 0.7 for France, 0.5% for Germany, 0.2% for Germany. China remains strong at 5.3%, exceeding its own targets. The IMF report suggests that the economy has become more self-sufficient. Domestic consumption and investments have remained remarkably resilient. Oil and commodity exports to India, China, and other countries, and high prices have allowed for rather robust oil export revenues. And of course, Russia's military-industrial complex has expanded significantly as the economy has been now put on a war footing. So the question for you, Vladimir, is this the new normal, or do you see headwinds ahead and risk?
Right. Well, first of all, welcome everybody, and thank you for a brilliant introduction. It's an honor for me to speak on the issues that I think concerns pretty much everybody. Now, to answer this question, I think we should start first with what exactly happened that economy, despite all the prognosis, still stands and in fact develops, and then come down to what could be the potential risks for Russian economy and whether it's still as stable as it looks like at this particular moment. Well, the first of all and the most obvious, and that's what you mentioned, of course, the export on the crude resources, something that in Russia is notoriously called the oil needle, as in the addiction to export the crude resources, is still quite viable. And I think despite the sanctions, Russians still manage to just redefine the way they would export the crude resources and to whom they would do so, in which way. And so the export of crude resources from Russia is still on a quite high level. And the truth is, the world in the state that it is now couldn't quite quickly replace that supply-demand problem. So, of course, Russia still profits from it. But there's more into it. First parameter that I would want to talk about, which is deeper than this tip of the iceberg, is how the Russian central bank has been handling the situation in face of the head, Elvira Nabiullina. It was, by the way, in Politico, I believe, was called the destroyer of the year. It's a question of perspective, of course. Somebody who saved their own country from collapse is seen as destroyer because she mitigated the effect of sanctions. I find it a very ironic definition. Now, what was going on is Russia could very quickly change the way the supply chains work. They replaced a lot of export targets, and they managed to reinforce the regions. And reinforcing regions happened because of switch to the military economy, because majority of the heavy industry complexes are located not in the central part of Russia, but around its regions. And using the revenue taken from exporting the crude resources, which were not very much affected by sanctions despite all the expectations, Russia pumps the budget into the military complex by that way generating the revenues and keep the businesses running. Military complex is not that affected by a high key rate, which has been quite high for the last couple of months. So that's one of the parameters. The second parameter is that Russia managed to create a tighter alliance with China, North Korea, and Iran. Frankly, it's been not a taboo, but it was not a preference for Russia to trade that way. And now, as it's quite clear that Europe attempts to isolate itself or isolate Russia from this supply-demand trend, of course, Russia doesn't see anymore a taboo to say replace some of the car industry with Chinese factories, so to even move a big nickel plant into China. Those parameters do contribute to the fact that the Russian economy still stands. Aside from that, and I think this is quite important to mention, there are two less visible factors that still contribute to the economy. One of them is because of the sanctions and because of the fear of the sanctions. A lot of ultra-rich businessmen that used to operate within the Western context, say in Europe, moved back to Russia because of, and so they moved their businesses, they moved the influences. We're talking about oligarchs, but we're also talking about large businesses. And a fourth point, which is absolutely invisible, but it's still there, is that Russia is now indeed focusing more on the domestic production and also including such sectors as, for instance, tourism. A high-profile, expensive tourism also contributes to the development of regions, because this is where the rich and the influential are intending to go to rest, because they would not consider Europe as a feasible possibility anymore. Not quite yet, but on the long-run perspective. So, in fact, all these parameters that we are seeing on reports on World Bank, they are showing the fact that Russia is very resilient and adapts very quickly. Now, despite the growing authoritarian control over how businesses are run, and quite frankly, growing authoritarian control over the general population, the Russian economy is still a market economy, and it's highly adaptable. And that also plays quite a big role in all that. Now, speaking of whether that's a new normal and whether there are risks, I think that would be very blunt to say that there are no risks. And there are four, at least those that are very visible, that I could introduce right now. And one of them has to do with sanctions. Now, sanctions did not quite cripple Russian military capacity, because they managed to quite quickly create the alliance with China and with North Korea in terms of supply and of sometimes the crude components, such as the shells for artillery or rockets, or even the drone production, which was used, which is now happening in Russia, but by the Iranian technology, as far as it is known. But the sanctions do affect the civil engineering and the civil complexes. For instance, one good example would be the turbines for the civil planes. Now, Russia still couldn't find a way to replace those. There's no parallel import, no replacement from China, no domestic production could replace those. Another example would be the components for cars, components for machinery, components for the factory industry, electric stations, for instance. Those components were not yet replaced. Now, I'm not saying they will not be replaced. Russia might build their own capacity or might try to find a way to either import them from elsewhere using the parallel import, or even try to figure out in which way it can be replaced by components from China. But that's on a run from 4 to 5 years could be a problem, because if the Russian civil infrastructure will start failing, and it might start failing, of course that will rise reasonable problems from population side. And that's the first possible danger. The second possible danger that is possible is a second side of how the Russian government currently tries to mitigate the problem of sanctions, and how do they nationalize the military complex plans. Because a lot of military complex plans and factories that have not directly have to do with military, but indirectly have to do with military complex, are currently being nationalized. Now, the reason for that is, of course, to avoid the corruption, to have a more manual control over how they work. But if the governmental control will fall into temptation to nationalize businesses that have nothing to do with military complex, that will absolutely hinder economy, and that will block the economical growth. Now, this is not an economical parameter I'm talking about. This is purely political will. And it's a question of whether the current governing powers will be wise enough to listen to the economical advisors, who in my opinion are quite competent, as the practice just showed, or they will fall into temptation to go into sort of kleptocratic state handling. This is a real danger. And now two more. One of them is quite invisible at this moment, but it was one of the parameters, not the main parameter, but the one that contributed to the fall of Soviet Union after the Afghanistan war. And had to do with the fact that every family had a soldier coming from the war, traumatized, crippled. And of course the social aspect started to feel the pressure from bottom up. And this tension could build up over time. Finally, there is still a very big problem of the brain drain. Now, the beginning of the war is curious observation. There's been a really big rebuke, almost an attempt to push out all the highly educated specialists from Europe and from Western countries back to Russia. And very quickly, I think the Western countries realized that that's not exactly helping the cause. And so the brain drain resumed. And the brain drain, especially in the developing and growing sectors such as IT, for instance, which is one of the most important in the current times, or lack of academic research, that of course on the long run will affect Russian economy. So it is stable for now. The question is how adaptive it will be on a run from 4 to 5 years. And some economists say 4 or 5 years, some say it a bit longer, some shorter, but I would say the tipping point is not quite yet. So this is my take on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Vladimir. You've introduced the subject of the alliance, growing alliance between Russia, China, Iran, South Korea, and
North Korea.
Sorry?
North
Korea. Oh my goodness.
Some difference there.
Can we start again? North Korea, of course, you know. And now I don't want to misquote anybody, but Henry Kissinger is famously supposed to have said that one of America's worst nightmares would have been to see Iran and China and Russia aligned. Well, we are here, you know, in more ways than one. But there are some who will also argue that actually Western actions have thrown Russia much more closely into China's embrace. The second point, though, here is that I think sometimes history provides a little bit by way of important lessons that we can interrogate. After all, you know, the Communist International movement meant that China and Russia, the Soviet Union, were allies, as they were with the Global South. Many countries of what we call today the Global South, which we will come to. So we also do know, of course, that there have been many trips between the two leaders. And here I'm talking specifically about China and Russia. And at the time of the Beijing Olympics, which happened to have been just before the invasion, sometime before the invasion, the two leaders spoke about an undying friendship, which they have reaffirmed several times. Curiously, though, I mean, China, and this is just an aside, China, unlike NATO and NATO allies who are publicly articulating support for Ukraine and providing, of course, all types of assistance, we don't see that type of assistance in terms of defensive military capability from China to Russia. Of course, there's other means of support. But Vladimir, my question to you would be, what do you make of this undying friendship?
Well, I would say that first of all, it's not from today, not even from this war. Even Soviet times, I believe there's been the saying, the Russian and Chinese are brother forever, and this is a saying that has been circulating back in the Soviet Union. And Russia has been quite actively investing in Africa, and especially in terms of education, especially in terms of agricultural education, for quite some years since the Soviet times. So, in fact, the alliance of China, an alliance of China and Russia, an alliance of Russia and Global South, it's not from today. It's just the fact that, unfortunately for the Western countries, indeed, the war in Ukraine did push this alliance a lot harder at this moment. And there are a couple of parameters that should be considered in this regard. And the first of them is that there's been a narrative running around that Russia, because its economy is a lot smaller than that of China, is becoming China's almost a vassal state. But I don't believe that's the case. And the reason why I'm saying that's not the case, because Russia has an overwhelming nuclear capacity. Now, one of the carefully running on the periphery discussions that have been going for quite some years now is that whether Chinese nuclear deterrence is sufficient to withstand, say, war with the United States. Well, now with the military alliance between China and Russia, that's not a question anymore. Another, in my opinion, important point is whether this alliance will be more preferable for Russia on the long run than, say, re-establishing back again the relations with Europe. Because the Russians, through the course of time, have always been indeed on a geopolitical level friendly to China and geopolitical level friendly to Global South. Socially, they always looked at Europe, especially at the Western Europe, as sort of a cultural role model. And I believe that despite the political grievances, this might still get restored. The question is whether and when. So this is certainly an alliance. This is certainly a bad news for the Western countries. But again, I do have a certain careful reservations on a very long term, how exactly the world will be reshaped on that sense, because there are more parameters than just economical and more parameters than just military. There is another quite curious take on this, and this is the reason why is it coming up on the press in such way that it's actually sparkled your question. Now, I think it's very painful for the Western countries to see that they actually failed to isolate Russia, and instead they isolated largely themselves, because the Western Europe, even in the United States, the Western world, as Russians like to perceive it, as a collective West, which is completely not true because we are the Western world is quite divided, in fact, is not the whole world. So the narrative that's been around in press, the whole world supports the Ukraine, the whole world is against Russia, did not prove quite right. Because the world, even in the media sentiment and in social media response, in the grassroots response, would not see it as their war. It's someone else's war. And why do we need to take part in that? So that's been the reason why I think this question is so aching and so painful right now. But the alliance itself, well, that's not from today, not even from yesterday, in fact.
Thank you. Thanks, Vladimir. I want to come back to Russia in Africa, Russia in the Global South, because I think you made a point which is quite accurate. There has been solidarity with the Soviet Union and many, many countries in Latin America, the Caribbean, Asia, as well as Africa, quite historically and for very, very long time. And I think the nature of those relations and the soft power that's actually exerted through that relationship, of which Russia is a beneficiary, it's a legacy relationship, has been rather underestimated and maybe undervalued. Also, I would say the same is true for the nature of the relationship between African countries and China, for example, which is not necessarily what we're here to talk about today. But I think it's all very, very pertinent in terms of adding to the context which you've just spoken about, the West being on one side of this particular conflict and the rest of the world saying, this isn't for us. And there are other compelling reasons why it isn't for us. But apart from the soft power that we see attendant to those particular ties, there have been also, if you just take a look last year, there are a number of summits where Russia has been very, very much present with the Global South. There was a summit in St. Petersburg last year, it might have been July, right, with African leaders. Then we've also had the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is growing. Turkey is a dialogue member. Turkey says Turkey is a NATO member as well and would like to be a member. And we've had that particular summit taking place also early July last year. And then we had, of course, the BRICS and the BRICS expansion network. There are 44 countries on the membership list right now for the BRICS. And the BRICS have moved very, very quickly. I mean, yes, their new development bank is no longer new. It's been in existence from 2009. It's AAA rated. And they've moved very, very quickly in this period of sanctions to do quite a lot to preserve the currencies of all of their member states. Not only have they taken a decision together with the Asian community no longer to stockpile the yen, the pound sterling, the euro, and the US dollar, they're building their own cross-border payment systems. They're bypassing SWIFT. They're engaging in trade using local currencies, and so on and so forth. And we can get into that. I'll invite you to another one of these things where we talk only about the BRICS. But they are doing a lot, and there are a lot of people who ask, is this a moment or a movement? Well, I think time will tell. But there will be consequences from the arrangements and the parallel institutions which they are putting in place today, which we can't just safely ignore. And Putin has in the past even suggested that the Western model of globalization has been only the next model post-colonialization, right? The period of colonial practices. So in many, many ways, the Global South, Africa, sees at least Putin's Russia, right, very much as an ally. Now, let's have a little bit of a discussion of Russia in Africa. Militarily, we've seen quite a lot happen in the last couple of weeks. What's your take on this?
As much as I'm more focused on CIS than Africa, there are two quite important points that even from this perspective can be noted in the context of our conversation today. And one of them is a very curious talk I once witnessed between African diplomats and some European functionaries in terms of infrastructure building. And the question of the African diplomats was, so why is that China is actively actually building the infrastructure, and why is Russia actively investing into our infrastructure, whereas you don't seem to be so effective and so quick at that? The answer was, well, because we're not colonial, we're not trying to buy you. But the truth is, when your country is in such a state that you need infrastructure right now to survive and to keep the prosperity going and to keep your infrastructure running and to keep your logistics going, you don't really care about that. You care about your survival and you care about your prosperity. So from their perspective, indeed, China and Russia are the saving hand. And it doesn't matter from their perspective how it seems from the position of, Western approach to it. Now, I do not criticize Western approach and I do not praise Russian. I'm just stating the fact that from their perspective it just looks a little bit differently. A second issue that I think should be addressed is what was happening after this infamous cop of Prigozhin, who's been killed, and we know that his presence in Africa was actually more prominent than that in Russia or in Ukrainian war. After his death, and in fact, according to some research data that I came across, some weeks before his death, there's been attempts to figure out what to do with all these mercenaries that are stationed in Africa, whether they should be a part of military of defense, and of course that completely changes the modus operandi. One thing is when you have semi-official mercenary group operating within the country, you have a plausible deniability. It's not really us, it's some soldiers, some people, we don't know who they are. The other thing is when it's in the control of actual Ministry of Defense and actual army. So right now we're going to see this very curious dynamic on whether Russia will try to establish another shady structure of mercenaries in Africa to try to maintain a status quo and a presence in the way it used to be with Prigozhin, or they will simply move all those mercenaries into the contracts of Ministry of Defense and admit, okay, there is actually our army operating on these things. That's kind of changed the dynamics a little bit, but it's a little bit too early to say whether Russia is taking that or that step, because I think they're, in that sense, trying to figure out what would be the most feasible. I don't think they want to really, stick the hornet nest with a stick. And a curious thing also is that I've heard a very interesting quote. It was in the same document I've been reading about, the same issue that I'm talking about right now, is the reaction of one of the African officials on that the Prigozhin is no more. And the quote was, Wagner, Beethoven, Mozart, whatever. They all more or less the same, which in my opinion is quite a hilarious perspective, or sadly hilarious perspective on this matter. But I hope I answered your question.
Yes. I'm sorry. Yes, thank you, Vladimir. Actually, the sentiment you've expressed with respect of Russia in Africa is, and if we talk about China and the rest of the world doesn't want to choose. And even when we take a look at countries like Singapore, very, very staunchly allies of the West, very much Western-oriented, very much aligned with the United States. But they've always made it clear, the last Prime Minister of Singapore made it clear last year at a meeting of the Asian group. The Foreign Minister said it very, very plainly. He said, our number one investment and commercial partner and trade partner is China. And China's right here. Our number one security partner is the United States. But we're not choosing between the two. We want to be friends with everyone. And what we want the West to understand is that working with one side does not in any way mean working against another side. And that's a sentiment that we hear echoed in Latin America, across Asia, and in Africa as well. And I think sometimes it's a message that to the West that requires a little bit by way of reflection, a little bit by way of interrogation, a little bit by way of listening a little bit more. When the European Union, through its Commission President, visits Africa and makes the point of the Global Gateway, the 320 billion plan for all sorts of very good and worthy projects. 150 billion are allocated to Africa. Of course, that's a different question, because very few EU officials I speak to can in fact identify projects that are through the pipeline and stuff. But that's not where I want to go with this particular comment. But when the Global Gateway is unveiled in Africa, and the point has been made, now you have a chance to choose between us and them, choose between us and China. It's not a binary choice, and I think Vladimir made that point. Apart from which, the One Belt, One Road project unveiled by China in 2013 is now valued at $1.2 trillion, and these are not my assessment. Okay, I mean, countries in Africa, Latin America, and across Asia, the global South, they don't want to choose. They no longer see the world in a binary, in a position in which there are binary choices to be made. They want cooperation, they want collaboration, they want stability. The biggest threat for countries of the global south is not a military threat for most of them. Yes, of course, we have failed states. Take a look at what's happening in Haiti. Take a look at what's happening in the Sahel. Let's put those aside. But the single biggest threat for most of those countries, including emerging economies, including the middle-income countries, are threats from inside. The political and social instability that arises when they cannot provide for their people. That is a threat that governments discount at their own peril. We only have to remember the images a few years ago as Sri Lanka neared that precipice of sovereign debt default, which it crossed over. The government fled. That's the serious nature of the threat. And I think that in these conversations, we really seriously need to focus on the need for cooperation. All countries have interest. The EU has interest when it engages with Africa as well. But Africa has interest as well. The Global South has interest, is to feed their people, find jobs and develop and pay their own way. And I think that I'm not quite sure why, in fact, we're missing this piece in a lot of the conversations that one has. The importance of development and development cooperation and what has been lost as a result of these rolling crises in the last 4 years, from COVID, then one war after another, and then we're fragmenting into blocks. Trade, international trade and globalization is the single most important development tool for countries of the global south. Now we're fragmenting even more. We talk about decoupling, de-risking, friendshoring. Costs are going to go up. We're rebuilding and re-industrializing. But that's an entirely different subject. But these are real threats. These are not threats of war, but these are threats to the very livelihood of people. And this is the major concern. But let's take a little bit of a dive, if we may, Vladimir, into things that are more internal to Russia. We did have a sense that very early on in the days when there was speculation, will Russia invade, will Russia not? And then after the invasion, well, you know, we heard that President Putin was dangerously ill, was about to die, had a cancer scare, was mentally deranged, or there would be a coup and he would no longer be there. But we see the elections in March just recently where he's still there.
So-called elections.
Okay, so-called elections. Well, we will have the Q&A and very happy to. But I will just say that there were elections in Russia that we saw, and Vladimir has a response to this, and he's still there. Okay, that's the point that I want to make. He's still there. What's your take on this?
Well, again, regarding the comment, I am absolutely happy to answer the comments after we have the Q&A, indeed, because I think that's going to be quite some heated conversation on some issues. And this is great, because discussion is where the truth is born. Now, my take on this is actually, again, on 2 points. And one of them is unfortunate or fortunate fact that the domestic perception of the war, blame it on propaganda, blame it on whatever else, but domestic perception of the war is that the people domestically would rather consolidate than separate. And at this moment of time, Putin is perhaps less popular than it's been in the beginning of his career, but the people who perceive the war as something existentially threatening to their rather stable lifestyle would rather consolidate than try to find the way to change. The truth is, the war did not quite affect the middle class as much as it was supposed to in the central cities in Russia, because the mobilization was mostly concerned in the the more rural and more poor regions, and the families of people who were mobilized were actually, for the level of those regions, compensated quite well. So that mitigated the effect of the war on immediate social response. But the consolidating factor of the war did play a role in that. And that's the first reason. The second reason is, indeed, I sort of agree of so-called elections, because Russia does not quite have an opposition anymore. Now, the only viable opposition leader was Navalny, and he's dead. Of course, there is some degree of liberal opposition, but they all exiled, they don't live in Russia, they don't really have power in Russia anymore at this moment. And the truth is, as much as the liberal ideas and the idea of democratization, the ideas of making Russia much more Europeanized and much more free, it's so great. But at the time of the war, people tend not to listen to those ideas. They tend to look at the immediate situation around their home, what's going on, and they say, well, maybe it's not the right time for change. And unfortunately, or fortunately, but that's a sentiment that is dominating the current grassroots. Now, it might change when the social pressure from the war, and this is something I mentioned in the first point, when the social pressure of the war will start affecting the middle class in the urban areas. But that's not quite the case at this moment. So the truth is, there is a consolidating factor. Whether it's alleged or not, that's another discussion, and it's not something that I'm pointing out. There's a consolidating factor, and there is no viable opposition. When there's no viable opposition, well, Russia already had its share of revolution. The majority of people who are currently economically active have seen the 90s, the perestroika times, the end of the 80s. They have seen that, repeating those times, for what? At this moment, it doesn't burn them as heavy as. So the fact is, yes, the leadership is still intact. It is fairly stable, but again, just like with my point about the economy, the dynamically, it might change in the course of 4 or 5 years. Which way, by the way, that's another question, because there's another type of opposition within Russian politics, and those are hawks. Those are those who say that they are too soft on Ukraine and too soft on NATO and too soft on the world. This is also opposition, and unlike the liberal opposition that is currently all in exile and trying to plot and trying to find a way back, those are in Russia. Another problem, by the way, which is just recently becoming more and more prominent if those who follow what's going on, unfortunately the Russian opposition that is currently exiled abroad are at war with each other. Instead of consolidating the powers and instead of creating a one front and one constructive idea, they actually work destructively. And not only against what's going on in Russia. Criticism is a viable point, of course, but also against each other. Who's the most prominent opposition leader of the West? Who stands the best for the Western idea? Who stands the best for freedom? Instead of creating the constructive narrative that Russians would listen to and say, hey, this is time for change because this just might work. No. The opposition functions in a very dysfunctional way, unfortunately. So now, of course, it's perhaps from my point of view as analysis from the outside, it's easier said than done. But that brings the reality of facts. At this moment, for people who live in Russia, especially not in the central cities, but in the periphery, they just don't see the alternative. Again, Navalny was very popular among the youth, was very popular, but he built his political career in Russia from grassroots moment before he became politician. Unfortunately, nobody of the current leaders could say the same. Might it change? Probably, but it's too early to say that.
Okay, now I wonder if we could move on, Vladimir, to the enormous reserves of soft power that we see in Russian culture and Russian language, and how that impacts the wider neighborhood and CIS countries. And the reason why I think that this is important for us to have a little bit of a discussion on is simply that, all states in the exploration or the use of what we will refer to as statecraft have usually, just to keep it simple, two forms of power, soft power and hard power. And of course, this war has in many ways shed quite a spotlight on Russia's military capability and the extent of that capability, certainly in the early days where there seemed to have been quite a lot of problems in logistics and supply and all those sort of things. But soft power is something else, right? Why don't you talk us through a little bit about what this means? This is this big draw-in pull of Russian culture and that rich, rich culture which so many of us can speak to.
This is somewhat a painful subject, in fact, because I think this is what makes it very difficult, not just for Ukraine and for Western countries, but also for the whole region that is known as Commonwealth of Independent States, which is basically the post-Soviet bloc, but also to Baltic states and to the countries that fancy themselves as Central Europe, which is also suffering from the traumas that were imposed from the times prior to Second World War and then the Soviet legacy. Now, about the soft power, there are a couple of dimensions that need to be mentioned, and perhaps I should take it in consideration with a little bit of a perspective of what Russia just might do after or during the next couple of years of the war in Ukraine. Now, first of all, the Russian concept of soft power is actually reasonably vague, but it's also represented in its law that has been implemented in 1999, which is called the Compatriots Law. Now, what it says is that basically means that every Russian speaker is somehow Russian. In Russian language, there is even two different words for Russian, in fact. Something that is related to the state, and something that is related to the ethnicity, culture, or whatever. Русский и россиянин. These are two different things. Russian and Russian in English, in any other language that would be that way, but in Russian it's a different thing. So they abuse this linguistic concept, and they say, well, if you are a Russian speaker, and there are, as we know, a lot of Russian speakers in the post-Soviet bloc and the entire CIS, in fact, in one way or another speak Russian, although it's not everywhere recognized as the official language at all, but at the same time, that's the truth. And so here comes this. I remember a colleague of mine say this very sad joke at the time of the beginning of Ukrainian war. Like, why do you speak Ukrainian? Do you afraid of repression? No, I'm afraid Russian will come to liberate me. And unfortunately, that applies to the CIS region and to Baltic states. The question of how Russia approached the language as an element of soft power is a very, very painful thing, because the CIS region is very, very diverse. Ethnically, it's very diverse. Culturally, it's very diverse historically on how all these countries have been, developing before they were a part of Soviet Empire. And the problem is, many of the CIS countries have the vision of their own striving for independence. But at the same time, the trap that they could fall into is trying to create a mono-ethnic state out of the polycultural and polyethnical reality. But by the other hand, there is a scary and angry Russia that they're saying, well, if you speak Russian, maybe you're Russian. Right? So this is the trap in which I think Ukraine, unfortunately, fell not even at the time of 2014, but just a little bit earlier on, because Ukraine is a polyethnical country, and it's a polylingual country. It's multiple. There are many, many ethnicities and people living out there. But many CIS countries can say the same. So the fact that Russia uses the language as a soft power makes it tremendously difficult for the countries of the Soviet bloc to mitigate the danger, because if they say, well, we ban Russian language, that will cause a social problem, that will cause the political problem, and that will cause the crisis. If they embrace the Russian language or the Russian culture, well, then they have to find a very smart and very clever way to mitigate that. And I think the biggest problem at this moment is that many countries within the CIS region, and especially the Baltic states, have problem on finding this right balance. And in this regard, I think I could address a very known narrative that is going around right now, that once the war in Ukraine is done, if Ukraine is defeated, then or Russia is defeated, which is less likely, but if that happens, then the Putin will not stop, and he will try to conquer the rest of Baltic states, to go to Poland or attack any of the CIS countries. Now, this is not likely to happen. However, it will be very simple for the Russian state, whatever regime there will be, I'm not talking about Mr. Putin himself right now, I'm talking about whatever regime there will be, to sparkle the separatism conflicts within Baltic states or within the CIS countries. How? For instance, in Latvia and Estonia, there is 11% of people who were there as a second generation from the Soviet times, and they have a specific status, which is called non-citizen status. So basically, they do have a passport, but the passport states, well, you're not quite Latvian, not quite Estonian. Culturally, they are fully integrated. If you ask them, are you Russian? They probably will say, no, I'm not. I'm Latvian, I'm Estonian. But this is a very easy to provoke, especially because out of fear of possible invasion and out of fear of what's going on in Ukraine, these states tend to have this knee-jerk reaction towards the people who they consider, well, possibly Russian, right? So in that sense, Russian soft power is very difficult to counter. My biggest problem with that is that unfortunately, with all this conversation of geopolitical interests and intrigues, we forget that the people are just trying to live there, and very often people are starting to be in situations when they afraid to speak their own language or afraid to communicate. You see countless situations abroad when you have experts from Georgia, from Armenia, from Azerbaijan, for instance. One asks a question in Russian, the other one answers in English because he's afraid to be associated with one power or another. But this is tragic. The language is just a language. And I think in that sense, CIS countries could take a bit of a look of what's going on, say, in Belgium, for instance, which is also bilingual, multi-ethnical state, but it's peaceful. Why? Because there's been agreement. An agreement has been made where it's supposed to be made, in parliament. Right? So I think in that sense, the future of mitigating the effect of Russian soft power is within understanding that the language is just a language, and within finding a consensus on how not to sparkle the attempt to create the mono-ethnical state within a completely different context. And this is the danger. And this is something that countries need to really think about, how to work with this.
It's a lot to think about, Vladimir. We're coming to the end of this little part of the conversation. Of course, there's a lot more with you. How does this end? And before I ask you your own thoughts about how does this conflict end, I'm reminded a little bit, that Immanuel Kant, whose work I have loved since I started reading early philosophers. He was born in Prussia at the time, in 1724, I think it was, in now what is the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, right? And he wrote probably one of the most famous anti-war essays in the history of philosophy, Towards Perpetual Peace. And it is rumored, and I don't know if this is actual fact, but the tenets and the principles to which he spoke were very much part of the landscape and the inspiration for the formation of the European Union as a project. And he was a pacifist, of course. And he also thought that there was something criminal in states actually assuming debt to fight wars, to kill. He thought there was something inherently wrong in this, I wonder what he would think now. And I don't want to ask you what he would think, but Vladimir, how does this all end? Or where does it all end?
It's actually
Does
fun.
it end?
Does it end? Well, funny you mentioned Kant, in fact. There's been recently just a discussion on whose Kant is between Germans and Russians when I believe officials from Kaliningrad say, well, Kant is ours. And how can Kant be somebody who's not exactly pacifist in the ideas? And the question of whether the philosophy really affects the decision making in Russia is a whole different story, which I one day would like to go into. Although that probably would not be Kant, but somebody Hegelian, such as later development of William. But anyway, If you think about how it will all end, I think we should consider multiple scenarios. And first, let's talk about the most pessimistic scenarios. Pessimistically, and that's a possibility that we should not dismiss, that might all go down the spiral of uncontrolled escalation. Now, I believe that none of the involved superpowers, and I'm talking about China, Russia, and United States and NATO, really interested in deliberately escalating. Because if you look at the dynamics of how it's been going through all these years of war, it seemed to have been very, very careful from all the sides not to, escalate deliberately. So I believe that the deliberate escalation is not quite possible unless at a certain moment the history will throw us at the brink of something that would look like a second Caribbean crisis. And in all honest truth, I'm not quite sure with the state of leadership right now and with the state of expertise right now that this crisis will turn out well, should that happen. So that's a possibility. Another option for uncontrolled escalation would be the accident. And if you study the history of Cold War, even by those documents that are now declassified, you know how many times did the world stand on the brink of nuclear escalation. Many, many, many times, and it was because of poor communication between the states and a poor understanding of each other, and also because of, just accidents. So accidental going down the spiral of escalation is a possibility which I think possible but unlikely. Possible because, we are in a very heated times. Unlikely because nobody really wants that. Now speaking of possible scenarios of who's win, or what is victory? Now, first, before talking about how it all ends, I think it's important to say what is victory in this situation. This is a zero-sum game. Russia does wage an aggressive war against Ukraine, and aggressive war, and according to international law, is a crime indeed, but there must be a very important distinction made between the aggressive war and unprovoked war, as Noam Chomsky has mentioned. The truth is, Russians, one way or another, do perceive the situation that has been going on around, not even from now, but from 2008, as a dangerous and possibly existential threat. Whether it's true or not, that's not for me to discuss, that's the way that's perceived. And in that way, the victory for either side is very hard to actually define. What I think would be the feasible scenario that would create at least a possibility of peace is something that, some years ago, one of the political thinkers, I couldn't quite recall the name, but I need to look into it, mentioned that the Berlin Wall has never fallen, it actually moved to Ukraine. And I think the feasible solution that could probably generate a chance of peace would be creating some sort of a buffer zone with the security guarantees, with this neutrality guarantees that Ukraine is secured on the western side, perhaps by the NATO or by Western forces, and that it has an independence guarantees, that is not conquered by anyone, not by Russia, not by anyone else. But the biggest problem about this scenario is that because of the war in Gaza, we do see a sort of erosion of how international law is being actually enforced. And because of the violation of the documents that were signed guaranteeing the independence of Ukraine in the first place, which were, by the way, signed by the France, the United States, and Russia as well, and these are not enforceable anymore. So to create the trust, we need to completely redesign. And by I don't mean the West, I don't mean Russia, I mean everybody at the table. The humanity needs to completely redesign how the security trust is built. So the protocols of international law have to be somehow reshaped. And for this, the only solution would be that everybody sits on the table, expresses the interests, and instead of approaching to zero-sum diplomacy the way it is going now, actually try to find a peaceful solution that works for everyone. And that comes down to the fact that there is no simple solution for this problem. And this is exactly why we are where we are. And this is the biggest threat that actually is there. So in my opinion, this should somehow get to that point, that how is going to be happening? I think this is a question of diplomacy.
Well, thank you, Vladimir. I mean, our conversation now can go into so many different directions, but we don't have the time for that. But certainly, I think that the application of international law and its principles have certainly been shaken quite dramatically in recent times. And one would take a look, for example, at the application by South Africa to the ICJ with respect of what's going on in Gaza. This is a country of the global south, right? That has in fact made such an application against the country in whose name the Genocide Convention was in fact enacted in, I think, 1948 or something like that, South Africa's application has been enjoined by almost every country of the South. Western powers have been curiously absent, though of course we do hear Belgium, we do hear Spain, we do hear Italy, we do hear, but Belgium, yeah, was the first one, yeah. But it's not enough, and this is part of the reason why the world is fragmented into so many different blocks. As South Africa says, we want to live in a rules-based order, but not one in which the rules change simply because the referee no longer likes them. It's a question of double standards and hypocrisy and all of those sort of things, which we'll save for another conversation. But this is where we are. And you're saying to us now that you think there is a role for diplomacy, right? Now, and this is our last point here. Has diplomacy failed? I believe that sometime in the 1990s, President Putin did ask President Clinton, I think it might have been, to become a member of NATO, because he said, or he felt at the time, we're on the same side. Now, there is this issue of a sense of grievance on the part of the Russians, right? The truth is, whether we want to admit it or not, I mean, the Soviet Union paid a huge price for the victory in the Second World War. They lost more than 20 million, was it 27 million children, young men, For many, many years, if you looked at their demographics, you would see that big downward spiral where all the young men were lost, and they've made up for it right now. But this sort of sacrifice that they held on to that Eastern Front for 2 years before there were any boots in Dunkirk. And there is a sense, too, that there was no respect over time, particularly in the last years, for that sacrifice. We saw many times in November when the armistice was actually being celebrated or solemnized, and President Putin was just simply not invited anymore. It's sometimes we have to forgo personalities to deal with leadership at a different level, which is respect for people, all people. And I think this is perhaps another dynamic that at some point I think we need to have some sort of discussion on. But has diplomacy failed? I mean, it's hard to imagine with positions so hardened today that there is a role for diplomacy. I myself personally don't see how it's even possible. But yet I was reading recently a very interesting report from the United States Institute of Peace, actually. It was January 2024. And their view was, and for me it was an interesting one, not that there is hope for diplomacy today, but that a few years from now, the sheer brutality and the sheer loss of life, which has been huge on both sides, might make states more willing to exhaust diplomatic modalities before committing to war. Time will tell whether or not this is true, but what do you think, Vladimir?
I fully agree with the last point, and explicitly agree with the point about the failure of diplomacy. In fact, one of the first things that I said when the war just started, and I don't quite remember which platform it was, but I did say that what's happening now is a failure of humanity, diplomacy, and common sense. Now, I would like to emphasize that, in my opinion, that's not just a failure of diplomacy, but that's the whole. It's the symptom of the illness that have been there since the fall of Soviet Union. And in my opinion, it's not just a fall of diplomacy now, as in to prevent this particular war, or prevent the annexation of Crimea in 2014, because there's been a popular opinion that if we were harder on Russia, that would not have happened. Oh, perhaps. But my point is that I think this is just a symptom of a way more underlying disease. And the disease is not understanding how to approach a completely different state with different culture, different interests, with the actual respect. Now, when the Soviet Union has fallen, there's been a tremendous amount of very happy and very enthusiastic initiatives from the Western side to modernize the country, to bring it to our orbit, to help them build a democracy, to help them create, for instance, the trade law, which did not exist at the time. And the Western institutions were very happily involved in that. But unfortunately, by doing so, was completely forgotten how do people actually live and feel about it. And the truth is, the regime that Russia has now is a product of a failed period of the 90s and a failed period of perestroika and a failed period of the end of the 80s. The current situation, it's a symptom of a way deeper problem than just diplomacy from one side or another. It's also a problem of lacking of an expertise on how to appropriately deal with something that is completely different than you are. And I think the biggest problem, and this is something that I like to futurize on that one sometimes. Now, Russia's gonna change inevitably somehow, but should the next period, such as the 80s or the 90s, come again, the same mistake should not be done. Because then the cycle will come again within 10 or 20 years and there will be no peace. So if the goal is prosperity, the peace and humanity, finally remembering a person in all these check games and strategic games, well, then I think there should be some serious investment in how to build the understanding, and then on top of that, create the dialogue.
Thank you, Vladimir. You know, it's interesting that we end on this particular note, because it would seem that, you know, the failure of diplomacy is a failure of one of its most important pillars, which is that of empathy. I think somewhere along the line we've forgotten the ability to empathize with others, not to be on their side, but to understand. And I think empathy actually is perhaps an important and missing ingredient. And to your point on what happened in the 1990s and the sense of euphoria, I mean, the dissolution of the Soviet Union as an empire, as a superpower, was one of the times in history where a superpower disappeared without war. You know, it sort of imploded. And historically, you know, rising powers and descending stars go to war, you know, to duce it out, sort of. But not Soviet Union imploded, right? But that brings us to an understanding, I think, of where we are and where we are not, and this period of turbulence, which challenges us. I mean, I really don't know what the rest of this year will bring, and we hope that 2025 is already maybe an environment for things that are much better. But I will end just with 2 points. One is that I think that in the 1990s, I don't remember the exact date, when China became a member of the WTO. I remember the euphoria from President Bill Clinton, who thought, you know, now, yes, you know, democracy has triumphed. We're all on the same side. China wants what we want, and we're all in this thing together, you know. But China was thinking, we didn't join to become a democracy. We never said that this was our end game. We are who we are. You know, we don't want to be you, but there are things we can learn from you. And they did. That's when they started opening up. They cherry-picked the very best of the market economy and capitalism and started experimenting with that. And then the rest is history, right? But that ability to not just be, perhaps it's a peculiarity of the West for a certain sort of exceptionalism and arrogance that in this image, the rest of the world shall be, but it's not how it is, you know? And somewhere along the road, we need to make account for that. And I think if we have empathy, then we close the understanding gaps in ways in which we haven't. And I want to end just with a little quote, which caught my attention as I was reading the weekend Financial Times. And it was a little essay on Kant, which reminded me of my love for him. And the author wrote, "In today's age, we are asked to accept war in all its dogmatic ways, political, economic, and social. Perhaps this is where the danger lies. War is fought in the mind even before it hits the ground. When the pursuit of complete victory risks leading to complete extinction, escalation is always a disaster." So, this is it for us, and now it's over to you. We have about, a good 40 minutes. Please, you, and then the gentleman in front of you.
Perhaps the microphone should be.
You made a very inspiring comment. You said that in the future, if you look at the sheer brutality that is going on in the future, leaders of a state might think before they act. Yeah. And that's my question, in fact. Probably if Mr. Putin had known what would have happened, maybe he wouldn't have invaded. I don't know. You don't know. Because certainly in the beginning they thought, oh, easy victory. We walk into Kiev, people will be throwing flowers at us, and that's it. But it didn't happen like that. Now, coming to your opening for diplomacy, what would you think is somewhere the boundary of an acceptable status quo for Russia? Where could they somehow say, oh, we've achieved something? Because it would be difficult to say we lost so many 100,000 people and we've achieved nothing. So would it be a kind of territory, or would it be what? Probably the declared ambition of chasing the people in Kiev is probably difficult to achieve. So where would they end?
Well, this question it's a great question, because actually it has two multiple dimensions at which you want to look to consider the answer. The first dimension is the general public sentiment regarding the war. Now, there's been multiple researches on that one. Some say that Russians are genuinely supporting the war, others say no, they're not. In my opinion, from what I make out of this, is that Russians do not support the war, but they do not like to be threatened. So, on this sentiment, for a Russian state, that would be actually very easy to sell the status quo as a victory. Also because the Russian state media and the propaganda is actually quite effective domestically. Now, they're a lot less effective externally, despite all the fears and concerns, but domestically they work very well for a very simple reason. Russia is absolutely huge, and a lot of people on the periphery still prefer to watch the TV over the internet, and especially when the internet is becoming less and less accessible, which is the case nowadays. That will be very easy to sell whatever as a status quo, unless Russians would feel humiliated. So as long as they could create such a narrative that it feels like not a humiliation, I think that will be quite a simple sentiment to sell. Now, there's a second dimension into it, and this is a problematic one. very, very problematic one, is that first of all, Ukrainians not gonna buy that kind of status quo because their political leadership put everything on stake not to have anything occupied by Russians right now. So it's gonna be very complicated for them to maintain their political influence and at the same time say, yeah, okay, Russians took our territory, that's okay. It's not gonna happen. And also, and it's most understandable for also from the political point of view. What is that now? A country can come annex 40% of territory and that's fine? Well, that doesn't look great and doesn't look right. And another dimension into it, which is connected to that one, in fact, is that unfortunately for everyone, at the times of conflicts, Russian regime is stronger. It seems counterintuitive, but if you look at this, even the Levada Center, it's the only remaining independent social opinion thing in Russia that still exists. It's fairly objective. If you look at those parameters, whenever there's a conflict, Russians consolidate around the regime. So the current regime will be interested in a conflict or another. The question is which conflict? Okay.
I think I would just probably add to the comment that you made that perhaps President Putin miscalculated, thought I could just roll in, you know. Well, there was a sense that in a couple of weeks it would have been over, right? But I think there was another miscalculation on his part as well, which is that he probably saw an opening as some sort of a wedge between the allies in the transatlantic relation. Don't forget, the year before, the world witnessed the Americans coming out of Afghanistan, how messy that was, and how upsetting it was for the Europeans who did not feel that there was enough consultation or notice. But they also knew they couldn't hold down Kabul without the American military capability. And then 14 days after that, America stood with Australia and the UK and announced AUKUS. And it was only the day before that Europe had unveiled its Indo-Pacific strategy and had no sense that this was coming. And France had been negotiating nuclear submarines with Australia for 10 years and had no idea. And France is an ally, okay? So I had written a chapter in the book called The End of Hubris. And perhaps President Putin felt the same way. He said, well, this is the opening, you know? And, you know, the Americans had been the ones for months saying he is going to invade. The Europeans would say, no, he's not going to invade, right? He was put in field hospitals on the border, and still Europe was saying, he's not coming in, you know. And the Americans were saying, yes, he's coming in. But America also said at the time, you know, that let it be clear, America will not be dragged into this, because the day we have an American soldier's barrel looking at that of a Russian, we will be entering World War III, and we do not want that. So you take a look at all of these things, and Putin, for whom that Berlin Wall in the name of NATO had moved, was, you know, how many hundreds and hundreds of kilometers east of the eastern border of a unified Germany after the war. So I thought, well, okay, well, you know, this might be the only moment there is. And he miscalculated how quickly the Allies came back together in no uncertain way. So I think there were a number of miscalculations, but I think the West also miscalculated. I think the West miscalculated, and I'm not talking about with respect of Russia, with respect of the rest of the world. The West was used to, you know, sounding that whistle and the rest of the world sort of aligning. Not this time, you know. And I think that was quite a wake-up call as well, you know. So a number of miscalculations, but please, sir. And then.
Thank you for the floor. My name is Dmitro Shkruko, National News Agency of Ukraine. So I'm Ukrainian, speaking fluent Russian, so I can understand what Vladimir is speaking about, because I also sometimes watch the Russian TV and hear all this propaganda. I can say right now, as Ukrainian, that we have had a lot of controversial points during our conversation, for sure, We will not dispute that. But, except some kind of Russian narratives, I have not had some kind of, true information. It is not my task to debunk all we have had during the last hour and a half, but my job is to answer questions. So my first question for you is about the Global South. Does any country of the Global South accept that invading another country and carrying the aggressive war is the right way to achieve any kind of political goals? Just a second, it is not the last one.
Okay, but I was going to answer that first.
Just remember,
Okay,
please,
yes.
because
No,
I will
please,
not
please,
take
please.
the floor second time.
Continue. Yeah.
So just I know for sure how that war will end, but it is not the, the place for me to express that opinion. I just want to ask you, Vladimir, if we are speaking about the economical growth in Russia, what part of that growth considered to be a part of the military production? The second question is, today we have the Korean missile fall in Kharkiv area, and it was proved by UN that it is Korean produced missile. My question is, if Russian military-industrial complex is so successful in producing weapons, why they use the Korean not that quality missiles to attack Ukraine? If we are speaking about the car manufacturing, you mentioned that like a positive one. Why the Russian car manufacturers are so concerned now that China is capturing the Russian market totally, and without no competition, neither from Russian nor from the Western side? If we're speaking about Afghanistan and impact on the society, we all need to know that during 10 years in Afghanistan, the Russian Soviet forces, lost 15,000 troops. Right now, during the last 2 years, according to official statistics proved by the Western colleagues, the Russian troops lost nevertheless than 420,000. According to the Ukrainian statistic, it's 630,000 troops. I will not refer now to Ukrainian statistic because it hardly could be objective. And the second point, you mentioned that there is economical growth now because the trade of the resources. Is the trade with China and India by oil and gas is more profitable than it was like in times than it was normal relations with the West? And the second point, you mentioned that the status quo. I finalizing. There are a lot of questions, but
No, I know.
This is brilliant.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm listening.
So that you mentioned that it is the Ukrainian leadership don't want to change, to accept the status quo on the battlefield. But it is not how to say the Ukrainian leadership listening to the people of Ukraine. And I can say you as Ukrainian, a lot of questions remain. I will not stuck on that. I know for sure how that war will end. Russian Empire started from the Kievan Rus and directly from Kiev. And the historical cycle already made its cycle. And Russian Empire will die in the Kiev also. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Len, do you answer first or I
yeah,
answer
let
first?
me answer first because my answer will be shorter.
Yes.
Because there are multiple parts of the question directed to you. The first point is there any country in the Global South that is aligned with the idea that it's okay to just walk into a sovereign country? Well, if you, sir, in your capacity, I'm sure you follow the voting at the UN General Assembly, and you will see that in the early days, almost all countries in the world, with few exceptions, agreed that territorial integrity and sovereignty were inviolable, could not be violated. All countries, including countries in Africa, including countries in Latin America, including countries in Asia. There's no contest on that. Where they parted company with the West was on sanctions. They vetoed, or they voted against sanctions on Russia. And in the case of South Africa, they were very, very clear about why they have vetoed sanctions. And I'll give you two examples. One, it's in South Africa's DNA in the new state of South Africa after apartheid, never to support sanctions because of the harm that befalls the people in the country under sanctions. So every year at the UN General Assembly, I only know that because I was a former ambassador and I was there, every single year in September and October, South Africa is the first one to stand up and say that the US embargo on Cuba is a historical wrong and it needs to be changed. And last year, for the first time, all countries in the world agreed, except the United States, of course, Ukraine abstained, and Israel. Okay? And this is the first time you got such formal announcement against the use of sanctions, preferring instead mediation. So to answer your question, the Global South is very, very clear on where it stands. And they see sanctions used by the West as a tool to secure Western interests, but not secured consistently. We take a look at what happened in Venezuela. So President Maduro and his government were sanctioned. 7.9 million Venezuelans were displaced during the period of sanction. It happened also that COVID hit them particularly hard. Thousands died because they had no more health care. Russia invades Ukraine. Europe needs to replace that source of oil and gas. Energy is important. And Maduro is dusted off and brought out from the cold, and it's okay. And oil and gas can flow again as it did from Venezuela. But at what price to that country of people who have died and left with nothing, and a country that is completely broken? So if sanctions are meant to punish, they should punish consistently. But sanctions can't be something that we turn on and off because interests change, okay? So these are my answers to maybe one and two of the questions that I could answer, and I leave Vladimir to respond.
My question was about the aggressive war, not about the European...
I'm sorry?
My question was about the aggressive war, not about...
Yeah, but it's all linked, sir.
Right. Well, on my turn, let me be crystal clear that I do not support one side or another. As academic or analytic, I can only operate facts that you see in academically published papers. And the statistics that you have provided on some sorts, I think, are quite viable. And in fact, I agree with many points you have made. So, for this to be clear, I am not supporting Russia, Ukraine, West, East, South, or whatever. I only approach the things from point of view of analytical facts. And the facts are not pretty, because unfortunately for all sides, it's a tragedy. People dying in Ukraine, people suffering in Russia, people suffering in Global South. All over the world, we have an extremely explosive situation where the humankind and the human rights are being completely shoved aside. So in that sense, I fully agree with your points. Not from point of view of ideology, but from the point of view from where it is. Now, coming down to the pragmatics and to answer your questions. Now, question regarding the fact that why is if Russia develops so well, why is it? Well, that actually comes down to the second part of my first answer. It is doing well now. We don't quite know what the dynamics will be. And it all comes down to so many factors that I could only present a couple of risks that are on the table, but I cannot say whether those risks will be mitigated or they will grow. So at this point of time, it is very difficult to predict whether it will go that way or that way from purely economical point of view and a social point of view. That comes down to your second question. What is the percentage of the military industry that contributes to the growth of Russia? Massive. Russia shifted towards the military economy, effectively, quite clearly, and it is currently generating money for it. It might not be forever so, because people have their limits. Unfortunately for Russia, maybe fortunately for Ukraine, but that's indeed the case. About the North Korean rocket, yep, I've heard that report, I have seen that, and yeah, Russian is well, it's pragmatically North Korea, and this is, by the way, there is more into it, which is very interesting. North Korea, in my opinion, provides Russia with the crude technology. The crude technology is cheap. You don't really want a sophisticated technology to be engaged at war at all times. So if the cheap one works, it works just as well. But the biggest problem there is that for Russians it's been actually taboo to deal with North Korea that way before the war, and now it's not. So this is a very dangerous development in my opinion. So yeah, I completely agree with that point. Another point that you have made regarding the impact of Afghanistan war, this is also within those 4 risks that I have mentioned. The impact of Afghanistan war, which was 10 years, on a social level in Russia was massive. It did not contribute entirely to the fall of Soviet Union, but it was one of the deciding factors from the grassroots cultural point of view. And the same might happen again with those people who die now in this absolutely unjustified and nonsense war. And I'm adding to the point of Len, I have mentioned this is the aggressive war. And from point of view of international law, of course, it is an aggressive war. It's not right. And when I say that the Ukrainian regime will not accept status quo, you say people, of course, people who live in the occupied territories or people who live in the territories that are currently under the siege, of course, they will never accept that. And it's understandable. And this is right. The question is, how should this all come to peace? Perhaps.
I think maybe there's a little bit of a model in the agreement in Korea, right? It is frozen. There is peace. International law prevails. There are boots on the ground there, but it's a peace that has endured for quite a while, but it involved concessions as well. The young man, please.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, is there, regarding the Central Asian republics, is there any option for the EU to, because there were talks of them like talking particularly to Kazakhstan or perhaps to Turkic states, is there any opportunity of bringing them to our side, sort of saying?
It is a brilliant question, which I actually was supposed to mention in my speech, but I haven't because I thought that would be better if we have the discussion, you know, more time for the discussion. Kazakhstan is indeed a very, very curious example. And I think it is probably something that we should take a better look at as an example of possible multilateral diplomacy now, because Kazakhstan, it's a huge country, it's very big. Its northern part is Russian speaking, its southern part is Kazakh speaking. They don't have the same problem as many other CIS countries in the sense of the nationalism or trying to push one language or another. So they have this perfect alliance between those parts. At the same time, Kazakhstan is trying to engage in trade with pretty much everybody equally. At the same time, they do not try to dispute getting out of Russian military alliances. And the reason for that is quite simple. It's in the north of Kazakhstan, there is Baikonur spaceport. And Russians do have their own spaceport, but they cannot quite launch rockets of the same capacity from there yet. So they're strategically interested in Kazakhstan, which means that Kazakhstan, knowing that the north of it is Russian speaking, knowing how dangerous it could be for a country, you know, to try to suddenly form alliance with another military power. They try to engage in this very multilateral, very careful balancing game on how to still deal with everybody equally. But there is another dimension into it which I find very disturbing, and by the way, it somewhat resonates with Yosser's point. There are people living there. And when I see from all the sides, especially concerning Kazakhstan and also Turkic states of Central Asia, the dealings with it quite often has been forgotten that there is people's interest that is on the plate, not just trade, not just security. And I think this is the tragedy of Ukraine, in my personal opinion, is that we're now talking about all the strategy, we talk about economy, we forget people who suffer. In my opinion, this is the central point of it. So yes, the Kazakhstan, in my opinion, is a very, very curious example of how things could be. Should people engage in very careful, game of understanding things. Fortunately, there's still no war there, and I hope it will be staying this way.
I think Vladimir as well, though India is slightly different in terms of its geography, where it's located, but it is in a neighborhood which from time to time is rather unfriendly to its interest. There's China, there's also Pakistan, these are nuclear neighbors as well, and India does a very, very good job of being multi-aligned, right? It's a member of the Quad in the Indo-Pacific. It's a member of SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's a member of BRICS with China. It has summits quietly with China and these go back from the Soviet times. They cooperate on certain aspects of space exploration. Basic, very, very basic, not anything too grand at the time. But they choose to carefully calibrate their interest, and they are multi-aligned. One more example of this is that they are part of the Russia-Iran new trade route bypassing Suez to Northern Africa. But they've just signed this mega deal with the United States, with Europe, also to get into Africa, going through the eastern part of Europe as well, right, through the global gateway. So, they're everywhere. And yet when President Modi is received by the United States, he is accorded a state visit, which is the highest level of visitation that the United States can accord to a visiting head of state from a foreign country. And why? Because India can't be ignored. India is the world's 5th largest economy, the world's largest democracy, chaotic as it might be, right? It has bumped the United Kingdom down to 6th place in terms of size of economy. It bypassed the European economy 2 years ago in February 2022. No, actually China did. I'm sorry. Thank you for frowning. China did, and China will be the world's largest economy by 2030. So here we have it. We have global output as well, that is tilting from west to east. And then we have the role of middle powers, actually seeding multipolarity and a wider menu of choice, which allows for what I saw recently, some faction of the media referring to as the hedge in middle, meaning the global south. So these are all curious and interesting times. But the gentleman, please.
Thank you. Willy Fautré, Human Rights Without Frontiers. I will come back to the issue of the soft power of Russia. 2 points about this. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, you rightly said that the post-Soviet states had the temptation to ignore diversity, to become mono-ethnic, also monolinguistic. I would say that was the case in Ukraine, and I remember very well that when the Ukrainian language was imposed on the whole of the country, many people were displeased. And at that time, when I had discussions here in Brussels with representatives of Ukrainian think tanks and also from the embassy, I said, well, look at the double system of federalism that we have in Belgium, territorial and also community-based. Maybe that's a solution. That concept was absolutely taboo for the Ukrainians at that time. The arguments were that we are busy building up our identity, and in keeping the Russian language in, well, any sector of society or part of the country would be a leverage for Putin to further divide and fragment our society. What is your opinion about that? And second point, very important, I think, about the soft power of Russia is the instrumentalization of the Russian Orthodox Church. And now the reactions that we see in a number of countries like Latvia, I think, Lithuania, and of course Ukraine, the temptation to ban the Orthodox Church that is in canonical relations, independent, well, that's a very difficult concept, but in canonical relations with Moscow, and some politicians suggesting that they should join the Patriarch of Constantinople. Thank you.
Thank you for brilliant two questions. In fact, they both have much more wide-going implications than just those questions. Now let me explain. The first one, regarding the soft power and regarding whether the Russian language should be banned from the country because it is a possible influence of Russia. But I understand that point. Every country, and this is something that has to be mentioned perhaps once again, every country has the right to identify what they are. Every country has the right for their own territory, for their own laws, and this is not disputable. Okay. However, the problem there is that any attempt to ban something that is de facto there would cause a calamity. And exactly that calamity can be used externally and abused externally to sparkle the conflict. And this is the first thing. So if you don't want the conflict to be sparkled, I think the most important thing to do is to try to mitigate it. And in my opinion, the Belgian system is actually quite smart. I mean, no Flemish person say I'm Dutch. That's just not the case. There is a Flemish identity, national identity, a strong one. So I think no Russian-speaking Ukrainian or Russian-speaking Armenian or Russian-speaking Georgian should say they are Ukrainians or Georgian or Armenian respectively. They just speak the different language. That's it. And this is the way, in my opinion, how you exactly prevent Mr. Putin and his regime or whatever comes after him, we don't know, to use and abuse this instrument against the countries that he potentially can invade or try to divide from the inside, because he will try that. And he did successfully already. So in that sense, I think the biggest problem there is that it's very difficult to mitigate on one hand, and there is of course always the fear, there is always the political groups, for instance, of course there is also people identity, especially in case of Ukraine. There's an immense trauma, I believe you would confirm that now, that you regard Russian language as the language of the enemy, and you have all the rights to have it so. 50% of the Russians speaking Russians, but this is I think this sort of trauma. That's the beautiful point to make, right? So this my take on it. I think there should not be taboo. The Belgian system, I think, is actually quite a diplomatic and quite a smart. The second point about the Orthodox Church, actually we talked about it in 2019 or 18, and you asked me the question of what is the function of Russian Orthodox Church and all that. And at that time I told you that the Russian state, the state it is now, actually does not have any viable ideology at all. Soviet Union had ideology which was over time declining. The Russian state does not have one. And I think the rise of Orthodox Church, the way we've been seeing that before the war, had to do with attempt to find some sort of viable state ideology that could be one of those three pillars of authoritarianism, which is the fear, the prosperity, and the ideology. But I think it failed. And if you look at the dynamics, I think Russians are much more interested to look for ideology somewhere in philosophical words of people such as Ilyin, for instance, whose main philosophical idea was not exactly fascism, but rather that the state is way above the individual. And that seems to be much more aligned with, you know, what's going on there. But the Russian Orthodox Church, regarding its banning, well, it's full of special security. And you don't want that in your country, especially if you're at war. So, yeah, that's a different thing.
Okay, colleagues and friends, I would say that in about 5 minutes we should wrap that up, and we're all getting a little bit thirsty and should have something to drink, so please. Maybe our last, unless there's anybody else who wants to make a comment.
I will be very brief. Thank you so much for your insightful presentations. And my question is, what do you think the impact of these strange and unusual times that you've described that we are living will be on the United Nations as an institution? Thank you.
I will just say that, you know, the United Nations has been under threat for quite some time, even in terms of not what it stands for, but what it can do. And I think, you know, in much of what we are seeing today, it's on the sidelines, right? You have the global south countries together with China, together with Russia, talking about reform of international institutions, multilateral institutions like the United Nations, like its specialized agencies. For the first time, I've heard President Biden say that he has no objection to increasing the number of seats on the Security Council. That's a first step. When that might happen, I don't have any sense of that. Okay. In the G20, when you take a look at what's going on, even with that agenda, we see the G20 evenly divided down the middle between the West and the rest of the world. This last time on the President Modi's presidency of the G20 last year, we were able to see the AU given a seat. So they are now a member of the G20. But that was precisely because of a lot of backroom support by the United States to have the Modi presidency leave a mark of some degree of success. Because throughout all of President Modi's term last year, every meeting of ministers of foreign affairs and ministers of finance, there was no communique which could in fact be tabled from the group. There were only statements from the chair because there was no consensus on anything, okay? But they were able to come out with that win. So I think the Secretary General, who is from Spain and very much speaks with a heart full of humanity, very much understands the need for the United Nations now more than ever. But we don't see countries coming together with in the spirit of multilateralism that is required for institutions like that to be successful. I used to be a director of in the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And even then, of course, it was clear, like you know, Thucydides, whose name I never pronounce well, you know, the issue of power, how we define power, you know, those with might do what they can, and the rest accept what they must. And even hundreds of years later, I mean, this is still the definition of power. And in those days, I mean, I still saw the way in which countries with more powerful were much more able to shape the narrative and, in fact, inform the agenda, even though we have a UN General Assembly where the vote is sacrosanct as well. But the compelling issues that come before the Security Council are something else. I would say, just because I hope to also be a more of a positive thinker than perhaps a pragmatist, that today I would say that we need the United Nations more than at any other time. But we need parameters for international law that are respected and consistently applied. That might in itself be an inherent conundrum. But I think we get into the point where we just can't continue the way we are, and we need to have a multilateral framework which is more inclusive than less inclusive. And perhaps power which is more diffused and not just concentrated in the hands maybe of 15%. I think there's that knock on the door, and it's no longer just a knock. It used to be an irritant, you know, but the clamor for that, for more equity and more justice, more empathy, more humanity, we hear it even from young people, the students of today, right? And I think there's a point at which we forego that common sense of shared humanity at our peril. That's not the right answer for you. It's not even an answer. But I don't quite know what to say. But anyway, you wonderful people, thank you so very much for joining Vladimir and myself in this conversation. I think the last time we had a conversation like this was probably here. We've done some webinars together
Corona
and
times,
stuff.
I believe we talked
It
about.
was before COVID, during COVID.
during the
COVID we started. But now is a chance for us to just you know, be ordinary folk and engage in some chat before we go home. But thank you so very much for joining us, and we hope to see you again. Thank you.